Hi, in this module I'm going to be going through some of the global effects units that Silent One has to offer. You'll find all of these effects built into the LCD display in the centre of the synth. To activate any of the feedback, simply tick the box to the left of the effect, and then if you click on the actual title of the effect itself, then you'll see the available parameters. So let's take a look. So let's initialize the preset via the menu here. And starting by activating the arpeggiator, this effect allows you to create sequences of notes. Immediately, if I hold down a note like this, you can hear that it's added a rhythmic pattern to the note. However, because the mode is in up mode, if I hold down 3 notes, you'll hear the 3 notes being sequenced. And if I change it to up-down mode, then it will play the notes up and then down, repeating the sequence. Now if I change the mode to step, it plays the notes in sequence of your choice along this section here. It's worth noting there are 16 steps in the sequence by default, but you can change the length of the sequence by adjusting the wrap time here. So I'll just change this to 8 steps, so it just uses the first page, although there is a second page here. I can then transpose some of the notes here to create a melodic sequence, and if I want, I can even change the velocity here too. So now when I hold down one note on my keyboard, the sequence will play like this. To add an extra dimension to the musicality of the sequence, you can also select certain notes to be held down for longer by clicking on some of the steps in the sequence under the title of Hold here. Now if we increase the octave range to 2 here, and then change the mode to random, and hold down 3 notes, you can hear the difference. Now it's playing random octaves of the notes you're holding down, creating a unique melody. The 2 other parameters I'll show here are the time and gate dials. These are fairly self-explanatory. The time dial changes the timing of the note triggers like this, and the gate dial changes the length of the note like this. This is definitely a tool worth exploring a bit further. The next effect in the chain is distortion. Distortion itself is actually a case of adding harmonics to a signal, and depending on which harmonics you add, different types of distortion are created, giving different dynamics and timbres. Silent One offers 5 different types of distortion, including overdrive, foldback, clip, decimate and bit crush. There are only 2 dials for distortion, the first being amount, which controls the amount of harmonics added and their gain, and the second dial controls the mix of dry, unaffected signal and the amount of affected only, wet signal. So let's give them a 50-50 amount and see what they sound like. First is overdrive, foldback, clip, decimate, and bit crush. Next up in the effects list is the phaser. The phaser is a device that makes notches in the frequency spectrum and shifts them up and down according to the internal LFO. However, you can also use the modulation panel to shift them, which I'll be covering later. For now, let's activate it and play some notes and see what happens. It's a strange effect, which really starts to work well with extended sounds like strings and pads. Next to the center frequency dial, there is the spread dial, which adjusts the notches in the frequency spectrum. You can hear that the smaller the spread, the tighter the phaser sounds, and when the dial is turned up, it becomes more of a filtering effect. The next dial across is the LR offset dial, which controls the offset values between the left and the right channel signals. This basically gives the effect of broadening the stereo bandwidth like this. Then similarly, The width dial sets the overall left-right weightings like this. The second row of dials down here begin with the LFO rate and the LFO gain. The LFO gain sets the amount that the phaser is modulated by the LFO, and the LFO rate sets the speed of the modulation like this. The next dial across is the feedback dial, which controls the amount of the output signal that gets fed back into the phaser, and dialing this up sounds like this. And then finally, the last dial is the dry-wet dial, controlling the amount of affected signal that passes through to the master output like this. The next effect in the list is chorus, which is fairly self-explanatory in that it adds additional layers of sound to thicken it, which is often described as a warmer sound. The way that a chorus effect works is by copying the signal passing through and doubling the copied signal while delaying its output slightly. So it's no surprise that the first dial in this effect is the delay time dial. This dial allows you to change the delay time from 1 millisecond to 40 milliseconds. So if I activate the effect here and bring the dial down to 1 millisecond, it sounds like this. And if I change the value to 40 milliseconds, it sounds like this. This is worth experimenting with, as depending on the general frequency of the notes you're playing, the delay time can have quite severe effects. The next two dials across are the rate and depth dials, which much like the phaser controls the frequency and depth of the modulations, but are fixed to those settings rather than by the internal LFO, so it's a case of playing with these until you're happy. The next control on this effect is the dual mode switch. When this is enabled, the chorus effect has two built-in LFOs and two delay lines, so in theory is adding an additional 4 layers to your sound like this. Then the bottom row of dials has the feedback, width and dry-wet controls. The dry-wet is as you'd assume from any of the other effects, while the width control is much like the width control we looked at in the phaser, spreading the stereo balance, and then the feedback control dictates how much of the outputted signal gets fed back into the input. One interesting point to make here is that if you set the delay dial somewhere between 1 and 5 milliseconds like this, and then add some gentle feedback, you actually get a flanger effect like this. The next effect unit in the chain here is the equalizer, which allows you to boost the bass and treble of your patch. When the bass and treble dials are at 0, the levels remain unchanged. This means that they are designed for only boosting the frequencies, and the second set of dials are for selecting which frequencies you want to adjust. However, it's worth noting that Sylenth 1 has an inbuilt normalizer that means when you boost a frequency, the master level will automatically adjust accordingly. The next effect unit in the chain is the delay unit, which can be used for creating echoing sound effects. You can set the delay times of the left channel and the right channel independently using the first two dials called delay L and delay R. As you can see, by default these are set to quarter beat lengths, but let's change the left channel to 1/16th notes and the right channel to 1/16th D. The D is for dotted notes, which means 1.5 times the length. So 1/16 D is actually the length of 3 30-second notes. Now if I press a key on my keyboard, you can hear a fairly short delay, so let's adjust the feedback dial, which would lengthen the time that the delay carries on for. Notice to the upper left of this screen there is also a ticked box called ping pong. When this is not enabled, the delay in the left and the right channels work independently like this. But when it's enabled, the left and right channels appear to work as though the sound bounces from one to the other like this. Next is the spread dial, which allows you to make the entire delay in mono when at 0 value like this. Next to that is the smear dial, which can make the echo sound perhaps more realistic in that the decay amplitude is not always linear like this. Finally, perhaps my favourite feature is the high and low cut options to filter the wet signal. Personally, I like to add a little low cut filter to the delay of any synth so that the tails don't affect or interfere with the overall track. Next up in the chain is reverb. On top of the usual controls such as dry, wet and size, which controls the size of the room you'd expect to hear similar natural sounds, Sylenth One offers a pre-delay dial which tends to work well with getting slightly unusual reverb effects by adjusting the time before the reverb takes place. Let's enable the reverb and take a listen. And now with the pre-delay dialed up, you can also adjust the stereo width here, and also set the dampness of the reverb, which acts as a low pass filter on the wet signal here. The final effect on the chain of Sylenth One is the compressor. This can be set to limit high peaks of sound. For example, when the resonance of a filter is set to very high levels and begins to self-oscillate, it can reach very high levels of sound. A compressor can also be used to increase gain to the quieter elements too, by lifting the average amplitude whilst also decreasing the peaks. There are 4 dials to the compressor. The first one is ratio, which sets the amount that the compressor affects the signal. For example, if the ratio is set at 4:1, then the input signal would need to increase by 4 dB for the output signal to increase by 1 dB. By default it's set to a 4:1 ratio, so let's leave it there for now. The next dial is the threshold, which sets the point at which the compressor kicks in. So if it's set at -5 dB, then only signals above -5 dB will be affected. Finally, the attack dial sets the time it takes for the compressor to take effect, and the release dial sets the time it takes for the compressor to revert back to its default levels. To be honest, there aren't really any hard and fast rules when it comes to compression, and even if there were, then rules are made to be broken. So have a play around and see what you like. You can't really go wrong. So that should have given you more of an idea about the range of effects you get within Sylenth One, and how they can be used to produce a host of different sounds. Have a play around with each effect so you can hear exactly what they do. If you do have any questions, you can head to the Producer Tech forum. Next time I'm going to be going through modulation by checking out envelopes, so I'll see you then.